Good morning, everybody. My name's Sandy Beach. I'm an alcoholic. And believe me, I look forward to this, being with my buddy here. We've had a lot of fun together, and they've been dear friends. Anyway, this morning, Bob didn't make the handouts yet, but they'll be ready. For those of you that haven't seen this before, we have no idea what we're going to do. And so the idea of a handout, we flip a coin to see who's going to go first, and then we just play off of that, and so I hope you all have fun. My purpose in this is to really have fun. Every part of AA, every part of spirituality, I believe, should be fun in honor of God. No matter what's going on, we can celebrate the great power that gave us everything. And so we're talking about the history of AA, so there's different ways of looking at it. And Bob and I look at it the same way, so I'm going to kind of set it up so that we see it that way. And the way I would start it out is, once upon a time, alcoholics had a horrible time on planet Earth. For thousands of years, they had to live in their hell with no hope of ever getting out. And they suffered alone because they didn't want to be with people, and people didn't want to be with them. And it just was a terrible, terrible disease. And you either ended up an outcast or in a sanitarium, a jail, or a pauper's grave somewhere. So it was absolutely hopeless once that disease took over the human being. And then 75 years ago, there was a moment of light that occurred in a hospital room that started this whole thing. And that light was passed on to the next alcoholic, Dr. Bob, and then it was passed on to Bill D. And that activity is still going on. And if you look at, kind of like the big picture, that everything started with the Big Bang, you could say the Big Bang took place 17 billion years ago, or you could say it's still going on. I like to think that it's still going on and we're still part of it. And as far as I'm concerned, the Big Bang and Alcoholics Anonymous was that moment in Towns Hospital when Bill went from a hopeless alcoholic to a person in a matter of seconds who not only was totally free of the disease of alcohol, the chemical alcohol, but he had a commitment inside of him that couldn't be broken, that he had to share this experience with every alcoholic in the world. Now, that's a lot to happen in a couple seconds. And that commitment inside of him, we all know how strong it was. He never faltered because of that experience. It was, and those of you that have had the spiritual awakening know that you just are so excited to pass it on to the next person. It's part of the package deal. You don't have to tell somebody, now that you've had this wonderful thing, be sure and pass it on. You can't stop the person from passing it on. They can hardly wait to talk to somebody to tell them about it. And so, I don't think that AA was put together by a bunch of drunks. I don't think that it just happened. I honestly think that it was created, and that was the moment of its creation. And that the alcoholics, all of us, have simply been instruments being used in this creation. And that the history, and Bob and I have talked about this before, when you study the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, you learn as much about God as you do when you study the steps. because you see that this is how it happened. It was a deliberate creation to solve this problem that human power could not solve, namely this horrible disease of alcoholism. And so when I think of the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, I think of history, his story. And in other words, when we're trying to understand God, God's a mystery. It's beyond any of our comprehension. And so we understand him through stories. And Clancy makes up a lot of wonderful stories. I try to make up stories there. And when you get through hearing them, then you understand, oh, that's what that means. That's what that means. And when you get through here in the history of AA, I think you'll see that there must have been a very loving God to make sure it turned out just like it did. And so with that premise or setup, I'm going to turn it over to Bob.
Thank you, Sandy. I'm Bob. I'm an alcoholic. And I, too, love being with you. Sandy obviously precedes me in sobriety, and he's been one of my heroes, and it's really a joy to be able to share with him like we do. Yeah, the starting of AA is so, I love that Big Bang idea. So what happened to Bill was literally a spiritual awakening, a transformation. I mean, it wasn't like an improvement. It wasn't all of a sudden that he got something. It wasn't that he understood something. He was a different man. And when you think of his commitment, I think of when God gave us the opportunity to start finding our solution in Alcoholics Anonymous. The 30s were a particularly pregnant time. I mean, we had the Unity movement, we had Science of the Mind, we had Emmett Fox, we had Christian Science, we had the Oxford movement, and I don't know if it had to do with the Depression or whatever, but there was an awful lot of spiritual activity that was going on in the world at that time, and a lot of pain that was going on in the world at that time, which might, they might be coincidental. For Bill Wilson to have that change, the change that Jung talked about with Roland Hazard, that has been unusual, but been happening from time to time. That we know that the Union Gospel Mission over a period of time has been sobering up people, bringing them to God, and so we know that these transformations have been happening. But for Bill to maintain his steadfastness is just extraordinary. When he went down to see, I love, as I say, that we didn't found AA in December 11th, 1934. Bill stayed sober from December of 34 to May of 35. He worked with 75 people. No one got sober. One committed suicide in his house. One stole all his and Lois's clothes. I mean, it was just extraordinary. In the first 2 years of his sobriety, in 1 year period, I think they lived in 52 different locations, on sofas and bedrooms, and I mean, think of that today. I mean, that is just extraordinary. When he went down to Akron on the business trip. Now he's working with people. He doesn't, he's sharing his spiritual experience, and he's had no impact. And there's a lot going on. He's down at the Oxford group. They're down at Sam Shoemaker's Calvary Mission, and they have a squad of alcoholics that are in that. And, but he's having no effect. So Silkworth comes and talks to him and says, I think you're taking he's complaining that he hasn't been very effective. And Silkworth says, I think you're going about it wrong. He said, you're hitting people with the spiritual experience first. He said, I think you need to hit them with the hopelessness of the disease. And then, in that context, you can share the solution. But prior to that, you don't have you're just going to get an argument to go on. So Bill went down armed with that piece of information. I don't even know how primarily he thought of it. But when he had that moment in the hotel, what hotel? Mayflower Hotel, where he knew he was going to take a drink, he put together the fact, maybe for the first time, right, that he needed to find another alcoholic, not just to help the other alcoholic to carry forward this spiritual experience he had, but to find another alcoholic for him to stay sober. So he calls Reverend Tunks. Tunks gives him a list. So Tunks gives them a list of 10 names. And we kind of, there's one retreat that I go to. At the end of the retreat, they give you a buffalo nickel, you know, in kind of memory of Bill putting the nickel in the phone. But the fact is he put 50 cents in the phone. Henrietta Seiberling was the 10th name on the list. He called 10 people. Now think of, I mean, I think of myself and my poor work habits. I mean, the likelihood that I would, the likelihood, I might for Alcoholics Anonymous, but the likelihood that I would call 10 people, and on the 10th people he gets the person. He goes out and talks to Henrietta Seiberling. They set up an appointment for Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob comes out. Dr. Bob, who was kind of a Bible expert and had been involved in the spirituality with the Oxford group for quite some time and had not been able to resolve his drinking problem, had Bill approached him on that basis, Bill would not, we don't believe Bill would have been affected, but Bill talked to the doctor about the hopelessness of the disease in a way the doctor had never been talked to. The uniqueness that we have to sit down with another alcoholic, that you can really share your experience and they understand that you too have done the unexplainable, that you too have violated, you know, all your personal codes and standards in the process of doing this. So you've hurt everybody in your family and you don't, with no explanation and not what you wanted to do, and you do it time and time and time again. And I found a solution. Now, Smith is really interested in this, and he talks, you know, and Bill then shares the solution with Bob, and it fits with hand in glove with everything that Bob has known. And then Bob, a few days later, goes on almost a week later, I guess he goes to the medical convention in Cleveland. He gets drunk, he comes back, and after they give him a couple of beers on the way to the hospital, he finishes the operation. How would you like a drunk proctologist? I mean, that would be... And there's something about the transition from being a proctologist to working with alcoholics that must not have been a very big jump. You know, might have been kind of a natural progression of things. But it is extraordinary today that, you know, that Bob was out after finishing the operation making amends. That something happened to him. And when that happens to you, you know, in the 12 and 12, when it talks about a spiritual awakening, he finds himself in the possession of a degree of, it starts out by saying that a spiritual experience is, he finds himself able to do, feel, and believe that which before, with an unaided strength and resources alone, he wasn't able to. He's been granted a gift, which amounts to a new state of consciousness and being. And he is set on a path that he tells himself he is really going somewhere, that life is not a dead end. Then it goes on to say he finds himself in the possession of a degree of honesty, tolerance, unselfishness, peace of mind, and love, at which he thought himself quite incapable. He has received it as a free gift, and yet usually, at least in some small part, he's made himself ready to receive it. And then Smith immediately said, we got to go find someone else, and they go, you know, a couple of days later, they find Bill Dotson in the hospital, and they go, and I was reading part of our history the other day, and it was interesting that I never thought of it before. I just thought it was a natural kind of progression that Bill and Bob go talk to Ernie. But they said how important that was for them to do it one more time. I mean, he did it once. I mean, he called on 75 people, no one got well. He changes his approach. He calls on Bob. Bob gets it. That's the first time. But Bill D. was the second time. And that was kind of a confirmation that they're on the right track. And then they get Ernie, who I think Ernie was number 4, but I'm not positive. You know, I love that Ernie married Sue, Dr. Bob's daughter. You know, the drunk that was living in Dr. Bob's house, you know, ends up marrying Sue.
Ran away with it.
Pardon me?
He ran away with it.
Ran away with her. Sue was a real package. She had a spirit. She was a very feisty person. And then, and the other night when I was listening to Susan Cheever, who wrote one of the biographies of Bill, she was talking about it, and she said something that I think is true and maybe not 100% true, but she said Bill was not trying to start Alcoholics Anonymous. He was trying to stay sober. So he was driven by a spiritual experience to share it, which I think is one of the things we talk about having to do 12-step work. I think if you've had the change that the book offers you, you almost have to do some sharing, some service, it just, I think is axiomatic. If you've had that experience, you're going to be, in some way helping other people. And then I love what they, over the period of the next 2 or 3 years that they, with the group in Akron, and Bill goes back to New York. Bill stayed in Akron till July or August of 1935. Now, what other time in the world could we have incubated Alcoholics Anonymous? Now, part of that was the job that he was trying to, kind of hang on to and work with that little company he was trying to resurrect. But the rest of it was, how important that what was going on. So he's down there from, June, July, and part of August. Lois comes down and visits, and then Bill goes back to New York, and they start the group in New York. And, and then they start the progression of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they stumble along, and in 1937, he goes back to Dr. Bob, and they sit down and they count noses, and why don't you talk about what happens?
Okay. I just want to take a sidetrack, and that is, it's fascinating that both co-founders were already in Oxford groups. And we know that New York, Sam Shoemaker and all of the, how that got started. But many people haven't heard how Oxford got to Akron in order for Dr. Bob and Ann and Henrietta Seiberling and the Reverend Tunks and all of those to be part of it so that he could call and get the names. And that honor goes to a man named James Newton. And somebody just showed me there's a biography about him. He was a fascinating guy. He was like the close confidant to Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Firestone, Lindbergh, and a French doctor that won the Nobel Prize for finding ways of treating wounds. He was the close guy. He was just like that. And he's also a real estate developer down in Fort Myer, but he was close with Thomas Edison. And Firestone came down to visit Edison. They were close friends, and they would talk and talk. And Firestone said, I need a special assistant out there to help me run my whole company. Do you know anybody that could be that good? And he said, yeah, this guy right here, Jim Newton. You take him out there. And he took him out there, and he did such a good job and became almost like another son that Firestone was going to give him the business. And that's how powerful this guy was. He turned it down. He said, no, you should keep it in the family. Now, while he was there, he noticed that Firestone's son, Bud, was a raging alcoholic and was just causing his father no undue trouble and consternation. And Newton had seen alcoholics get sober in the Oxford group, so he took Bud Firestone with him on a business trip and took him to one of the big weekends. The Oxford group used to have these big weekends where they'd have big speakers and, yeah. And Firestone gets sober. He just gets transformed. He's all excited, and he wants to go to more Oxford group meetings. So they come back, and his father says, my God, what happened to you? He said, oh, I went to the Oxford group. What's that? And he told him all about it. He says, well, we better get one of those here. So Oxford coming to Akron was a command performance. It was a big deal. Everybody in town came, and of course, Frank Buckman, the founder, and he brought all his top people, celebrities, and it was a major, major event. So people like Ann Smith and Henrietta Seiberling saw it in the papers, and so they went there. And so without that little wrinkle, there wouldn't have been any Oxford group in Akron for these pieces to get going together. So I just wanted to throw that in because I just read that biography, and some people are just extraordinary, and that guy was just amazing. James Newton, yep. Uncommon Friends, I think is the name of the book, if you're interested. And it mentions a lot about AA in there. So where were we leaving off in 1937? He's out and counting the people?
Yeah, Bill comes back.
Oh, he comes back, okay. We all know that part. Anyway, they're trying to evaluate how many are sober and how long, and as they add them up, they suddenly realize they have really stumbled on something. I mean, they suddenly realize we really do have something that could help all the alcoholics in the world, and we have a responsibility to do this right and to get it done. And so Bill, being the wheeler dealer, he comes up with the plan, just like that, and calls the group together, and he says, I've got the plan. He talked it over with Dr. Bob, and Dr. Bob was halfway enthusiastic about it. Dr. Bob thought it'd be a good idea to write a book, but the rest of it he wasn't so sure about, because Bill's plan was that on Wall Street they had just come out with chain stores, 5 and 10s and department stores. So he decided that we needed a chain of drunk tanks was where we had to go. And then in order to get the word out to all the other cities in the United States, we would have to turn the present members of AA into paid missionaries. And they would take a leave of absence from their job. And they would go out, one of them over to Toledo, and one of them over here, and one of them over here. So we had the paid missionaries, the chain of drunk tanks, and a lot of money. That was absolutely essential, and the book. And of course, when they objected, Bill had a trump card that he always played. Anytime anybody objected to his wheeler-dealer plans, he would go, now wait a minute. There are thousands of alcoholics within gunshot sound of here dying. Do you want to sign their death warrant, or are we going to go ahead with this plan? And then they would go, ooh, I don't know, okay. Well, you go to New York and you raise the money. So that was the thing. The secret to AA was money. And he went back and he thought, boy, people would hear about this and they would donate money, and he went off around. Nobody would give him any money, nowhere. And he was complaining bitterly to his brother-in-law, who had married his sister Dorothy. He was a doctor, Leonard Strong, who was a great friend. He paid for Bill's hospitalizations in Towns Hospital. He really cared. And he knew Rockefeller's right-hand man. And he said to Bill, I could call this man, Willard Richardson, and maybe he'd see us. Would that be a good idea? And of course, Bill's going, yeah, Rockefeller, that would be wonderful. So he calls Willard Richardson. He says, yeah, come on over. So off they go, and Bill goes up in the elevator, and there they are in the next office next to Rockefeller. And so as he walked in, he's going, we are really close to the money now. It's just in the next room. I mean, we've solved our problem here. And so they shared with Richardson, and he really liked it. He was a preacher also. He saw this first century Christianity as kind of what Rockefeller saw when he saw the Oxford. This is just people with no churches, just out doing God's work on their own. And they loved it. And he said, well, can you come back and talk to some of the other people of Rockefeller's advisors? And they had people who later became trustees or various parts of our program, Frank Amos and Leroy Chipman, and I can't remember all the other ones. And so they made a presentation, and they just were so impressed. So they sent a team out to Akron to investigate and take a look at it, and then they prepared a written report for John D. Rockefeller. And later on, through Willard Richardson, they heard that Rockefeller read this report, and he was so moved by it. He felt that this is one of the most amazing things that's happened in the world, that this movement could be something that is spectacular, but that money would ruin it. And so we were saved greatly by Don D. Rockefeller by not giving us money. He gave $5,000 they put in the church, Riverside Church, and that was to save Dr. Bob's home from being foreclosed, and it gave Dr. Bob and Bill a monthly draw. I forget if it was $50 a month or something like that. Oh, okay, so that they could keep working on AA and have enough to live on. And so they drew on that. And in spite of having been told by Rockefeller that money would spoil it, Bill went right around the corner and came back to those advisors with his ability to talk. And he talked them into forming the Alcoholic Foundation, a nonprofit that he could then go out and raise money for this foundation. And of course, that was the predecessor of our service structure now. The New York office and the general service was the Alcoholic Foundation. And again, he couldn't raise any money. And so he shifted his focus. He suddenly realized the place to make the money is off of the book. So we abandon the fundraising and we turn our attention, not in a spiritual way. This is going to save us because we're going to sell hundreds of thousands of, do you want to pick it up from here? Hundreds of thousands of copies of the big book all over, and we're going to just have plenty of money to set up the drunk tanks and the paid missionary.
And in New York, around that time, Fitz Mail came in, and Hank Parkhurst, and Hank was had worked for Standard Oil, and he wrote the chapter to the employer in the big book, and he was a businessman and a real promoter. And so there were a couple of cases where they thought they had Reader's Digest interested in doing something with the big book, and one of the publishing companies, I think, offered him a $1,500 advance. Harper's offered him a $1,500 advance for doing the book. I think the most fascinating thing for me in this period of time is the Oxford group had, the core of 6 of the steps. They had the idea of a surrender, putting God in your life, doing inventories, helping others, coming clean, making amends. And one of the great cores of the Oxford group, too, were the 4 absolute: honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. Bill and Bob, so when Bill grew up, Bill was a fascinating guy. Now, he was the guy that had the core spiritual experience, but he was also a guy who was very suspicious of organized religion. He, the absolute belief system that rubbed him the wrong way. There were certain things that he just could not, even though he looked at one point in time, later we'll talk about Father Dowling, even though he looked at one time about converting to Catholicism, when he really got right in front of it, some of the things that you just absolutely had to believe to be a Catholic were just too much for him to make that gap, and he thought it was would be a bad idea for our fellowship. So we are incubating our fellowship. Cleveland's starting, and Cleveland's got a core of people that many of whom were Catholic. Dr. Bob, in Akron is, got the largest group at that time. Cleveland becomes bigger later, and Bill is. And they increasingly kind of feel that the Oxford group is not to be their home. The Oxford group kind of works with the up and out rather than the down and out. And depending upon what historians you read, Bill would make it seem that over a period of time that the Oxford group was getting uncomfortable with them, that they kind of thought he and Lois were not maximum, which was kind of the term that they used, if you were really, had the right attitude and so forth. And drunks were unmanageable, and they thought that Bill shouldn't be spending all his time. Now remember, at this time, there is no Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, they're just squads within the Oxford group. And Bill separated from the Oxford group in 1937. Bob separated from the Oxford group in 1939. Cleveland, I don't think ever was connected to the Oxford group.
They came to Akron.
They came to Akron, but once they kind of broke off and went over that, they didn't do that. So there were some very interesting things that were going on as Bill started to incubate. You know, and many of us are familiar with the story that Bill, who tended to be depressive, when he started writing the book, you know, he would pass the chapters around and they'd, you know, over at his house. Now, it's interesting, he saved Dr. Bob's house, but didn't save Bill's house. It was, you know, I don't know why. It might have been economics, but, you know, they lost the home on Clinton. But Bill started to rough out the chapters to the book, and they would collectively kind of go through this. And this period of time was one of the most fascinating, I think, because we were in the process of being presented through God and through Bill's selection, the principles that were to be the core of our program that, you know, were extraordinary. And I think because of Bill's childhood, because of his background, because of his relationship with, because of his views of government and democracy and his views of religion and what he found attractive and not attractive, he was able to bring that intuition along with the experience he was having in Alcoholics Anonymous to sit down one day, or not sit down, he was lying in a bed, he was kind of down, he wasn't feeling very good, he was in one of his spells, and he took a legal pad and took the 6 steps of the Oxford group and expanded them into what today we know as the 12 steps. And when he was done, he counted them. He said there was 12. He kind of liked that, thought that was a nice number. And of course, it, you know, really turned out to be quite a nice number. They were really disappointed. Money was very, very tough. They were, you know, living kind of hand to mouth. And they didn't know quite what they were going to do. They started a stock company called the Works Publishing Company. And they went out and went to a stationery store and bought stock certificates and filled them out and sold them in the groups for $25 a share, I believe. And they sold about, I don't know, $3,000 worth of, no, more than that, because I think Town's about $2,500, you know, in the book, and I think maybe they raised close to $5,000, and that was the funds that kind of allowed them also to continue and while they were writing the book.
Okay. I'm gonna just tell extra stories about the same material because there's some that I really like, which is in this context of we're now going to focus on getting money by selling the book. And Harper's did offer him a $1,500 advance after they read the 2 chapters. By the way, we didn't cover this. Bill had written a couple chapters and the first part of the doctor's opinion, and he used it for fundraising. He had his story, more about alcoholism, and that first thing, you know, the doctor's opinion is broken into 2 parts. The first part was used for fundraising. And if you look at that, the last sentence says, "You may absolutely trust anything these gentlemen say." You go look in the book, and then he says, and then we went back to the doctor and asked him, and that's when the rest of it comes in. So there's the 2 parts there. But he decided that they would print their own book. They didn't want Harper's, that they're going to go print it themselves. So they went to a printer and started getting all the costs. And that's where they made the decision to use the real thick paper so that people would think they were getting a lot for their money. It would be thick and be a big book. It was to entice people to buy this. And so they calculated out, and I don't remember the exact calculation, but it was, we could get it all done for $1, and we're going to charge $4, so there's going to be 300% markup. So if you buy the stock in this, Bill's going to get 1/3 for writing it, Hank's going to get 1/3 for promoting it, and you, the stockholders, will get the other 1/3. And when these books go out in carload lots, you will be millionaires. This is at the AA meetings, or they weren't the Oxford squad meetings, and some of the people did buy them, and Parkhurst bought a lot, and it caused a lot of trouble later on, which, if we remember, we'll go back to when he wanted to redeem, they wanted to get his shares back. So one of the things, they had an Irish drunk who knew a radio guy named Gabriel Heater who had a show and talked about all current things, but he always had a little segment of human interest. And it was all set for this guy Ryan to appear on the Gabriel Heater radio show. And as a last effort in the book sales, they sent out a postcard shower to all the doctors east of the Mississippi. Listen to the Gabriel Heater show, big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, How to Cure Alcoholism, and they thought the doctors would buy this because they have so many alcoholic patients. But Ryan his sobriety was not very good, and they were worried whether he would stay sober until the Gabriel Heater show, so they put him in the YMCA in New York with 24-hour AA guards night and day to make sure that he showed up for the radio show. So that helped sell some of the things, the radio show. And then Bob mentioned Reader's Digest. They went up there, and the editors, when they heard what AA was, they said, oh, that's unnatural for Reader's Digest, so we're going to do that for sure. And I think they had 12 million subscribers. So that helped sell shares. When we went back, it's going to appear in the Reader's Digest, 12 million, blah, blah, blah. So when they got the book halfway printed, they went up to Reader's Digest and said, we're ready to go. And they said, go what? They said, remember we were up? He said, oh, yeah, I remember you guys were up here. I took it into the top editor, and he didn't like the idea at all, and I forgot to call you. So you can see it was just one thing. And the printer, Cornwall Press, he must have fallen in love with AA, the idea of it, to let him even print this book with $500 down or something like that. And it just looked like they were going to end up owning the book, because when the postcard shower went out, they went down to the post office box. They thought there'd be mail bags full of postcards in there, and there was like 8 postcards. 6 of them were from drunk doctors. They couldn't even read their names. And they had 2 orders for the book, or 3 orders, something like that. So you can see this was not going well. And the Liberty Magazine article, well, can I keep going on these 2 things? Okay. In 1940, see, the book came out in 39. 1940, Liberty Magazine had an Alcoholics in God. And it was the editor wanted to say something nice about AA. So that came out. But at the same time, something came out that got more inquiries than the Liberty Magazine article. Does anybody know what it was? Any of you historians out here? Huh?
Rockefeller dinner?
No. No, it was an anonymity break by the baseball player, right. He was the catcher for the Cleveland Indians. He caught for Bob Feller. And the manager of the Cleveland Indians had heard that the Oxford group could sober up alcoholics. And he had this catcher who was an all-star at one time, and he was drunk and doing terrible. So he took Raleigh Helmsley, that's who it was. He took him over to the Oxford group. And he said, I understand you can get this guy sober up. I'll give you any amount of money to do it. And they said, well, we don't take money. But in order to do it, he has to go to Akron and go to the hospital. He had to go see Dr. Bob and go through the hospital down in Akron. They said, we can't get him in the hospital. He won't go to the hospital. Well, we're not going to work with him unless he goes through the hospital with Dr. Bob. So they went back, and the manager had him deliberately hit by a pitch. And he had the trainer run out and look at him and say, this is so serious, we have to go to the hospital. And they took him off. And he got sober and started hitting and catching and just doing wonderful. So the sports writers wanted to know, why are you doing so well? He said, I joined Alcoholics Anonymous. So sports fans all over the country wrote New York wanting to know about Alcoholics Anonymous, and they got more inquiries than Liberty Magazine. And then Saturday Evening Post came.
And at the same time, I think in 1940, Rockefeller came back into the scene, and Rockefeller decided they were going to hold a dinner for Alcoholics Anonymous and invite all the industrialists. And Bill added up all the money in the room. It was like $2 billion. It was, I mean, it really was he sent out invitations to a couple of hundred people, and I think 100 people showed up. They had tables, and at each table they had one or two recovered alcoholics. One of the side notes that I think is kind of cute, in the first edition, the Red Book, the last story in the book is The Lone Endeavor. And all these stories were written by, we had a newspaper man, and was he in Akron or New York? Or did we have one in both? But I think it was in Akron, and who edited, we got most of the stories out of Akron, but he edited the stories that the men were writing. And before I forget, what I want to say that I also think is kind of extraordinary, if you were going to kind of invent Alcoholics Anonymous, if you were going to invent a cure for alcoholism, wouldn't your attention be focused on the disease? And our focus is on the alcoholic, not the disease. So our story about the disease and about the recovery is told through the experience of the alcoholic, which is almost impossible to argue with. So if you think that had we come out with a didactic, scientific approach, and Bill, viewed himself, as an somewhat educated man and loved, science. I love that our approach was so personal, and as a result of that, as was our approach with our relationship with the higher power. It was not centered in what you believed, it was centered in your experience. And I really believe that the core of that is what is the source of one of the great powers of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the reason that it had to be told through the stories is because it's about God, because it's about a power greater than ourselves, and you could not didactically relate that to anybody. And I think that's been our source of strength, is that we just say, it works. This is what we do. Come do the things we do, and you will have the experience that we have. And I think that that's one of the great uniquenesses of Alcoholics Anonymous. So Rockefeller has a dinner. The last story in the Red Book was Pat Cooper, The Lone Endeavor. Pat Cooper was a guy before they published the big book, they did a couple of hundred, 200 or 400 manuscripts, and they sent them out to different people to kind of, as a last review, to go through. One of the people they sent them to was the Catholic Church, to kind of make sure that there wasn't stuff in there, because the Catholic Church had a deal that members of which I'm a member of the Catholic Church, could not attend anything else that was religious of another, religious organization. So if they felt that Alcoholics Anonymous was a religious organization, Catholics would have been forbidden to go there. The book was reviewed favorably. They had one recommendation that we changed heaven on earth to utopia or something, but it wasn't a major change, but it was significant and important that we did. The other thing that came out of it, one of the psychiatrists, I believe, came in and made a recommendation that we change the steps from the first person singular I to we. And just when we think of today, what a wonderful change that was, and take some of the more aggressive talk in the relationship, the early part about how it works, humbly on your knees, and if you read the book and don't like it at this point, else read it again or throw it away. Those kinds of things were softened. So Rockefeller has the dinner. Oh, and Cooper, they put him on a bus. He's in California. He reads the manuscript. He gets sober. They put him on a bus to come tell his story. Everybody gets off the bus. Cooper doesn't get off the bus. Cooper is loaded underneath the last seat of the book, and his story was taken out for the next printing. Many other people got drunk. We never took their stories out of the book, but Cooper's was taken out, immediately. So Rockefeller had the dinner. He said, we think John Rockefeller was ill. He couldn't go there, so his son Nelson came to the dinner and said, my father is very, very impressed with this. He thinks it's a powerful, important movement, but he thinks that money will ruin, Bill again thinks he's going to, finally get in touch with the money, and he thinks that money will ruin this, and we give them all our support. Later, John, after the dinner, and there was an article in the New York Times that was important and received some correspondence coming in. Rockefeller wrote a letter to everybody who was at that dinner and said, but as a struggling new organization, they do need some funds, and I'm writing a $1,000 check to the organization. And out of that dinner, we received $3,000 to $5,000 for almost each of 5 years. That money was later paid back, which was an unusual phenomenon as we fully developed our sense of being self-supporting. And then in the spring of 1941 came the largest, and out of the articles in the Cleveland Plain Dealer and out of the Liberty article, our membership grew to about 700 members by the end of 1940. I think I'm close to correct on that. And in 1941, Jack Alexander, who was an investigative reporter for the Saturday Evening Post, it was brought to his attention about this new phenomenon of Alcoholics Anonymous. He was given the assignment, and this was a guy who was kind of a crime buster. I mean, he came to the project with the idea of kind of finding out what the scam was, very skeptical investigative reporter, and he got involved with it and came to deeply love Alcoholics Anonymous. He too went to Cleveland and Akron and New York, and was very taken with what he saw when that article came out in the spring of 1941. We got 8,000 requests into Alcoholics Anonymous. Our office, which, I mean, you know, was just this little shoe polish company that Hank and Bill had. The first time when we had these 400 requests, you know, they answered them all by hand, and now they've got 7,000 or 8,000 requests coming into the office, and with volunteers, they went in and they answered them all by hand. And Alcoholics Anonymous launched itself and became, you know, started to become a phenomenon at that point.
I'm going to tell one more story and then we'll take a break. Nobody should sit more than 50 minutes. The brain shuts off. I just wanted to tell another Catholic thing. I was brought up Catholic, and my sister was, and she still goes there and loves it. How do you go to church when you can't get out of bed because you're so drunk? So it wasn't that I, you know, made a conscious decision to stop going. I just slid away. But Bob alluded to it, that the Catholic Church was very adamant that its members not attend something that wasn't Catholic. And that included the Oxford group. So when the Catholics from Cleveland were going down to Akron, mainly brought down there by Clarence Snyder, and they got sober, which they did. And then they're in church, and the minister sees the same thing as the baseball player. He sees these guys look wonderful. What's going on? You know, Jim, you look wonderful. Oh, Father, I'm going down to the Oxford group, and they made me sober. You can't go down there. That's very, very bad. But this is where it keeps me sober. I want to keep going down there. And Clarence was driving him down. He was an automobile salesman. He had 2 demonstrator cars that they let him use. So he had a caravan, and almost every one of them were Catholics. And so
there were no Catholics in Akron.
Yeah, that's right. They didn't have the problem down there. I mean, it's not that there weren't any there. None of them ended up being alcoholic and getting in the Oxford movement. And so finally the priest told them, if they went anymore, we're going to excommunicate you. You're going to be out. And so Clarence went down and started to talk to Dr. Bob about this, and he said, I'm going to start a separate group up in Cleveland, and the big book had just come out. He said, I'm going to call it Alcoholics Anonymous, but it'll look just like this. We'll get together, we'll pray, we'll talk about sobriety, etc. And Dr. Bob said, no, you can't do that. You can't split away from, because they were, unlike New York, they were just one family, the Oxford group in Akron. They met at the Williams home, and alcoholic or non-alcoholic, it was just, you know, and he just couldn't, it was going to break his heart if they broke away. And Clarence said, look, these Catholics, I'm going to start it. And someone offered a home up there, and he told Dr. Bob, we're going to have it on Wednesday night or whatever. And so Dr. Bob and a bunch of people from Akron went up and tried to stop it. Tried to stop that group from starting, but they couldn't. So they started it, and they called it Alcoholics Anonymous. See, it had a name, the Cleveland Alcoholics. So that was technically the first group to call itself AA, technically the first AA group. So Clarence, as you know history, in later years, he broke his anonymity, and he would, in newspapers, say, I started AA.
And he never did that, he never pulled that crap until Bill died.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a lot of animosity, but so let's take a 10, 15-minute break and come on back.